I'd like to welcome people to the February 26th meeting of the IMAG Working Group and the Global Alliance for Immune Prediction and Intervention, GLIMPRINT. It's the last meeting for February. I appreciate people coming to listen today and to participate. We have an interesting and, for us, somewhat unusual speaker who's going to be talking about economic perspectives on epidemics. And we're very glad that Jacob was able to reach out to get this seminar organized for us. As always, I need to remind you that the meeting is live streamed and recorded for future viewing. Tom Helikar, myself, Jim Sluka, Lorenzo, and Ellen are always available to take your comments and suggestions. Please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us to tell us what we can do better. We have a variety of communication channels. They work better when you use them. Please help us get the word out about the meetings, about activities, and about our seminar archive. We would always appreciate your help in building this community. If you have a publication that you would like to share, an announcement that you would like to share, we can put that up on the IMAG Wiki. Contact Jim Sluka, jsluka@iu.edu if you want to do that. Jim and Jacob and Tom have been working to update the GLIMPRINT website so that it's more functional. That is a freer website in terms of what we could do with it. If you have seminar, meeting announcements, workshops, job opportunities, anything that you would like to reach out to this community with, you can do that online. And you can also reach out to Jim Sluka or Jacob directly for help posting your information. Coming up, we have John Hickey from Duke University, Reed Chapman from NIH, with possible special guest also from NIH to be confirmed. Then James Duran from Bath talking later in April. As always, we depend on the community to suggest speakers. You've heard me say the same thing for 170 meetings, which is please feel free to suggest yourselves, your students, your postdocs. If you've spoken before and you need to speak more about the same topic, that's fine. If you've spoken about a topic and you have other things you've worked on that you would like to share with the group, that's fine too. Again, I want to emphasize that there is no discrimination within this group with respect to seniority. We are happy to have undergraduate projects, graduate projects, postdoctoral projects, as well as senior faculty. Our goal is to be a place where members of the community can share and develop ideas in a supportive and free way. And so we would very much appreciate any suggestions that you have for speakers. Lorenzo is very effective at getting people to come to speak. And so you can also think broadly. Who are the people that you've heard who've done work that you find interesting? Those could be experimentalists, clinicians, members of the biotech community, or journalists or economists or philosophers or sociologists, anyone who you feel would provide an interesting perspective to build this community. We still have the OpenVT multi-cell modeling competition. We've extended the deadline again to March 28th. If you have written an agent-based model of tissues in the past, published it between the beginning of 2024 and today, we would very much appreciate you considering a submission for it. There are 3 prizes, so the odds of winning something are not bad. They're not very big prizes, but they are real. And there's an opportunity for speaking if you're going to be at SMB this summer, and of course as part of this seminar series as well. If you're interested, you can email us at openvtprize@gmail.com. So our seminar is going to be from Andy Atkeson, an economist's perspective on behavior and the dynamics of epidemics. And Jacob would like to show a few slides before we start with that. And so I will turn the screen share over to Jacob.
So this talk is part of the series of lessons learned from modeling COVID-19. It's 5 years after the epidemic, and we're trying to figure out what happened and how to prepare ourselves not to repeat mistakes we did in the first epidemic and model a little bit better. So we gathered a bunch of people who wrote lessons learned papers, and we reached out to them. Andy was one of the first two to respond. We're going to reach out for more and hopefully get more here. We analyze each one of those papers, and actually Andy added a few more beyond the original paper we found out. So this, whatever is going to be seeing, are lessons learned from all of those papers we analyzed. And since there are 19 lessons, and this is only the short version, I'm just going to skim through them. Andy, you're going to stop me if you want to say something as I'm showing those slides, but I assume that you will be talking later on. But I'm going to skim those for the record to show that you have extracted many lessons from those. So 19 I counted. This is from all of those three papers. So I had 5 slides only for your lessons learned. You're going to talk about them. I won't take your time. However, you did have 3 actions or recommendations of actions to fix things that I was able to locate, and you'll be able to comment later on how accurate was able to extract them from your papers. So first of all, you want to develop quantitative economic epidemiological models to help policy responders in the next pandemic. This is one of your actions that are needed. First order importance of research going forward to figure out if the public be more skeptical of public health warnings, or will our experience lead us to take future threats more seriously? This is about behavior, and yes, it's also important. Many others talked about behavior as well in their lessons learned. And the third one is developing off-the-shelf research protocols of learning about transmission routes, the natural history of infection, and dynamic immunity upon pathogen detection. Those are your 3 recommendations. Did I miss anything important?
No.
Okay.
Well, I'll talk.
Okay, so I'll let you talk, and we're going to be back at the end of your talk to those standard webinar series questions, and I want you to answer those later. And I know that you have many questions, so go ahead.
I would want to enter into the discussion with a full group relatively quickly, so I'll go through these. Available on the slides is links to the papers that I'll be drawing from, but most of what I will be drawing from is my experience. So to start off, I am not somebody who regularly studies this subject. I'm someone who I've had a long-term relationship with not just the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, but other Federal Reserve banks and the Board of Governors. And I was watching COVID in China in the beginning of 2020, and one failure was that modelers and the CDC didn't really warn the Federal Reserve that something big was coming. I started bugging the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis and just saying, you have to find out about as much about this as possible, because it looks like it could have very serious economic ramifications. And so economists came at this with the perspective. Let me explain what I'm showing you here. The Federal Reserve in this century has faced 2 big crises. One was the financial crisis of 2008, and one was the initial reaction to COVID in asset markets in February and March, well, particularly March of 2020. And the way the Federal Reserve learned to respond to those crises was to print a lot of money to buy assets up in markets, financial markets, to stabilize them. So I'm just showing a graph here showing the nominal stock of assets in the Federal Reserve. And what I want you to emphasize or see in this picture is that in 2008, they bought a little over $1 trillion worth of assets, and they had a response that was 3 times larger, $3 trillion in March and April of COVID. And then they actually continued it through COVID, buying another $2 trillion. So the economists that I was talking to were showing a willingness to make massive policy responses to the COVID shock, to the economy, Congress as well. And I guess the main message I want to discuss today, if possible, is that economists got very frustrated having interactions with public health people, that there was no similar scale response in terms of, let's go spend a lot of money to try to find ways to efficiently mitigate the transmission of the disease. And so I never understood why. And I'd be curious uh, to have discussion of that point. So I'm going to come back to that perhaps several times, that particular question. So when we talk about lessons learned, I guess John Rice made this point that we learned the same lessons over and over. There was already pre-COVID concern about influenza. I find it ironic that in September of 2019, the Council of Economic Advisors, actually Trump's Council of Economic Advisors in his first term, wrote a document about we weren't prepared with vaccines for influenza. And I took this paragraph out of it saying a pandemic influenza could have serious public health and economic consequences. My sense was there wasn't much of a plan beyond coming up with vaccines of what to do if we did have a pandemic influenza. And I'm a little bit concerned that even after COVID, we don't have much of a plan other than coming up with vaccines. And the concern is if you have a fast-moving disease, to develop the vaccine fast enough that it can have a useful impact is a tricky business unless you lock down the economy again and wait till you get a vaccine. That wasn't the best outcome for the US economy. So I've been asking people involved. I had the opportunity to ask Mark Lipschitz when he was on his way to the CDC. He's like, well, if we got you $50 billion to spend on targeted mitigation, what would you do? And that's a question I'd like to pose as a lesson learned, is that perhaps we could come up with an answer to that question. One thing that I'll be talking about behavior, and this is again coming from an economist reaction, not an epidemiologist. The early models of COVID that we saw, in the spring of 2020 gave you reason to think that the pandemic, would largely be over in, say, about 6 months. It was kind of fast moving. It started off doubling in 2.5 or 3 days, doubling times, and people would project that it would kind of go through the population very quickly unless we did lockdowns. But I think economists pointed to that there was an endogenous behavioral response that came from private changes in behavior that did much of this slowing the speed of the epidemic. And ex post, that bought time to develop vaccines starting in early 2021, to implement the vaccines. And so we did get a big benefit from vaccines that came as a result of the fact that the spread of COVID in the first year, 2020, and even in 2021 was slow in comparison to what you would think would have happened with the unmitigated transmission. Kind of a rough way of saying that is that the COVID epidemic entered a linear growth phase very quickly, and it stayed in that linear growth phase, I would say, for about 2 years into early 2022, when then Omicron, took off. And so I'm just showing you a graph of cumulative deaths in the United States, and we would get a couple 100,000 a year. And what I want to stress is for the first 2 years, that's linear growth. And what linear growth meant, this is data from the CDC serology data that I used to try to estimate the benefits of vaccines. The premise of the benefits of vaccines was, in the end, we all got COVID. Omicron would break through what uh, both back. I think I've probably had COVID 4 or 5 times. I might have it now. I'm feeling a little sick. But what it's showing here is the blue dots is from CDC serology data. They would do 2 serology tests, one identifying people who have been infected, and those are the blue dots. And you see again this kind of linear growth. And then the orange dots are people who have either been infected or been vaccinated. And so the gap between the orange dots and the blue dots is a measure of those who've been vaccinated but not infected. And so our claims is that vaccines, we managed to get vaccines into people in 2021 before they got infected for the first time, and that substantially reduced their mortality rate when they finally did get infected with COVID. And so, one of the papers that's posted, we estimate, maybe 800,000 lives got saved just trying to do what was the difference in the mortality rate when you got COVID not being vaccinated versus when you got COVID and you'd already been vaccinated, and then counting the portion of the population that managed to get vaccinated before they got COVID. But the theme that I have here is that behavior, some combination of private behavior and lockdowns, played a critical role in allowing us to get vaccines into people and saving a bunch of lives. That did come at a very large economic cost. But in some sense, one lesson is we had more time than we might have thought in the spring of 2020 to develop vaccines and get them into people. So the question is that something a pervasive phenomenon? Like next time, should we expect this type of behavioral response? And so I'm just pointing to there was a paper about the spread of COVID in Manaus that was in Science in 2020. It seems in Brazil, in Manaus, in the middle of the Amazon, COVID followed a pattern that would be more like what was predicted in March or April of 2020 of going, this is the gray bars, of going through the population very quickly, in a few months' time. And I had an opportunity in May of 2022 to attend a joint Nobel symposium in Stockholm that had medical people and economists. I managed to have a raucous dinner. Mark Lipschitz was on one side, and Glenda Gray, who's a prominent South African public health person. That's and her reaction to the idea that endogenous behavior might mitigate the transmission of disease automatically was in red. That's ridiculous. So I would say it's an important question as to whether this type of behavioral response that we saw was purely the result of policy, was endogenous, and is something that we would expect to see in other settings. Okay, but the hunch of economists is that there are economic forces that are going to drive the effective reproduction number of a disease towards 1, and thus put you in linear growth rather than exponential growth. And, I call this a hunch because we're not epidemiologists and we haven't studied enough. But the hunch is really coming from thinking about, in a very simple level, an interplay of like 2 equations, or in a more sophisticated model, 2 blocks of equations. So one block of equations is going to be kind of mechanical. That one would have a model of human activity, the level of human activity, which I'll call Y. And as you change activity, that will change the effective reproduction number of a disease at any point in time. And so I just wrote a little ad hoc equation here that says the effective reproduction number at any time is going to be a function of the basic reproduction number of the disease, how many people remain susceptible, the level of activity with alpha being some positive exponent. And then there would be other factors that might, holding fixed activity might alter the basic reproduction number, seasonal variations, a more transmissible variant arrives. And I'll come back to if you did targeted mitigation, you would think of targeted mitigation as something that slowed transmission of the disease, holding fixed the level of of activity that would contribute to economic output. And then you would have a second block of equations, which would be behavioral, that would say people react to the danger they perceive, which would be some measure of incidence, say new infections, new deaths, etc. That would be X, and that they would reduce their level of activity in response to the perceived danger, and then you would capture other influences, say for instance, a public lockdown, which would, lower activity beyond what people would do on their own, being afraid of incidents. And these two blocks of equations have a tendency to drive the effective reproduction number towards one, basically because as incidence goes up and down, you're regulating activity, and kind of a stable point is having this effective reproduction number close to one. And so let's imagine that this instinct or this hunch is correct. A modeler is going to face a number of challenges that I want to discuss. One is in the immediate phase of the disease. In the immediate phase, until incidence climbs up to a level to scare people enough to reduce their activity or to have a lockdown to lower the effective reproduction number, you're going to be in a exponential growth. And when a disease is doubling every 3 days, figuring out when it stops, if it stops on a Tuesday or a Friday, is it has a big impact on the death rate. And a lesson I have when I talk to undergrads, I said this modeling problem seems to be very similar to like valuing a new tech firm. When is AI going to wipe us all out in 3 years, or is AI going to take decades to have its impact on the economy? It's clearly in an exponential growth phase now, but conceptually it's the same problem, of when does it move to a linear growth phase? Okay. And so just to illustrate that, I'm sure you're all familiar, in the first couple of weeks in New York, deaths were growing very rapidly, but then at some point they transitioned to a linear phase. And so when you were if you're in an emergency and you're sitting there watching a disease growing exponentially, it's very hard to predict when you're going to transition to this linear phase. If it had kept going for a while, the cumulative deaths in New York could very easily have been much higher. So in terms of giving public health advice, you're going to have to give it very quickly in an emergency situation. And it's going to be a modeling challenge to think about how reliable is that advice, and what is the degree of uncertainty at this point where it transitions to a linear phase. The other main challenge you have is figuring out, are people going to respond on their own, or does the government have to do something? So I'm pointing to two papers here, the Goolsby and Syverson one, which this is just a little picture that tries to give the sense of what they did. They systematically looked at mobility data, cell phone mobility data, in locations that cross state or county borders that had different public policies in the initial phase of the epidemic. So this is the area where Illinois and Iowa come together. I think it's called the Quad Cities, these 4 cities here. And so I guess Illinois had a shutdown policy. This is just an example, and Iowa did not. And you don't see that big a difference in the cell phone mobility. This Sheridan et al. Article was using data on expenditures in Sweden and Denmark, and made, again, a point that the decline in expenditures that you saw didn't seem to, Denmark and Sweden had very different public policies about lockdowns, but the initial behavioral response didn't seem to be so different. So one challenge that I'm going to talk about a little bit is figuring out, if you're giving advice on public policy, how much, how much do you have to add by asking for lockdowns versus what people will do themselves? And predicting what people will do themselves is a very significant challenge. Once we got through, say, early May of 2020, and we had perhaps had some confidence that we'd entered a linear growth phase for COVID, then there were issues of, when can we lift lockdowns, when we can let people go back to school, how should we understand the impact of policy on the progression of the disease? And economists came at this again with this hunch that there would be endogenous responses of behavior would keep the effect, once you're in this linear phase, would keep the effective reproduction number around 1. And that gives you two implications that I want to discuss. So one is, imagine that you try a lockdown where you mandate a reduction in activity. This is the UT. You mandate a reduction in activity, YT, beyond the natural reaction that people have to incidence, which is this sigma times X. And then if you say, but in equilibrium, people will privately change their behavior to keep the effective reproduction number close to 1, what you would expect to see is you have a lockdown, incidence starts to fall because behavior has come down, the effective reproduction number is dropping below 1. But as incidence comes down, people will start privately taking, going out more, basically violating the lockdown, until activity comes back up to get the effective reproduction number back close to 1. So that the private response, you would anticipate, will start undoing the public policy to a certain extent. And then the benefit in terms of reduced incidence that you would get would depend on what you thought this parameter sigma was. And of course, in a more complex model, it would be more complicated. So the central lesson is, if you're trying to just reduce behavior bluntly below what people would do otherwise, there's going to be a natural offsetting reaction from private behavior that one would want to take into account. On the other hand, if you came up with interventions, which I model as reductions in nu T in the first equation, that reduce transmission holding the level of activity fixed, you will have an endogenous response in the same way that initially, say you did testing, you convinced people to wear masks. You convinced people to stay 6 feet apart. If you could reduce transmission holding activity fixed, initially you would reduce incidence, but that would allow you to have an increase in activity as an equilibrium outcome. And so you might not change incidence much, but by allowing for more activity, this could be very valuable economically. And so I want to take a pause for a moment and say, a lot of the frustration of economists was asking public health people, why aren't we doing targeted interventions? Why aren't we spending $50 billion on targeted interventions? And I participated in these discussions within Federal Reserve, where Federal Reserve presidents were saying in the spring and summer of 2020, they were confident they could get significant appropriations from Congress to fund such interventions. And we would ask public health people, if we got this money for you, what would you do with it? And we didn't get any answers. We were told, testing won't work, this won't work, that won't work. And so there was a lot of frustration. I expressed that frustration multiple times by saying, in the spring and summer of 2020, we ran the census. Every 10 years, the US runs a census. Pretty much every developed country runs a census. This graph shows you the in the dark blue, the blip in federal hiring every year. So I would say we hired 250,000 census workers to visit 40% of the homes in the United States in spring and summer of 2020. And why didn't we consider this cost about $25 billion? Why didn't we consider hiring a similar workforce to engage in targeted mitigation? And the answer might be that would have been a total waste of time. But I think that a challenge for modelers is to give an answer to that question so that next time, the disease will be different, the transmission routes will be different, what you want to do will be different. But the broad question of would it be worth it to throw a lot of money at targeted mitigation is something economists would be very interested in. I'll go quickly over this. I mean, in reality, the effective reproduction number wandered above and below one, so we got waves. Tracking those waves is a challenge that I want to discuss. I want to preserve time for discussion. So, in my own work, if I had people respond to new infections, it was as if they were anticipating the danger that they would face from going out. Then the system was very tightly controlled, and I was not able to get waves. So, in a very ad hoc way, by assuming that people responded to deaths as opposed to new infections, and because deaths occur with COVID at a lag of several weeks after the new infections, the fact that people are reacting to a delayed signal of the risk that they face, that allowed the model to have waves in response to various shocks. In the same, I mean, I think this is a similar thing in engineering. If your feedback mechanism has a delay in it, you can get oscillations and waves. And so that was, I would say, a small part of the big question in modeling behavior of what is it that people are reacting to? And how are they making choices of, what do they believe? Are they watching the news in New York and not watching the news in Italy, et cetera, et cetera? So that is one big question that comes up. But the other big question that I think puzzled economists as we looked at COVID is that in the initial phase, so this is a graph where the red dotted lines are weekly COVID deaths, and they're going in waves. And this is one measure of economic activity, the blue line, which is employment. But you could do this with other measures of economic activity. So the puzzle these data posed is that looking at the initial reaction, we have in the spring of 2020, this big increase in deaths and this giant decrease in employment. So you would estimate, if you were estimating what's the reaction of economic activity to incidents, you estimate a very large reaction. But then quite quickly after this, as you see, we have waves of deaths, waves of incidents. We have a very smooth response of economic activity. So if you were to try to estimate an elasticity of economic activity in response to incidents, you would get very low responses. So I never had any success in modeling this pattern. This is, I would say, a lesson learned from COVID, is that somehow the initial responses were dramatically different than what happened, even once you started in the summer of 2020. And so, questions you might ask is, did people learn on their own to do targeted mitigation? And then the US is only one experience. We have many countries that you could have asked similar questions. And so I'd encourage people to talk about that. But I think the real challenge, one of the questions posed is, can we truly forecast the pandemic through modeling? I don't think we're going to be able to do that. We can't forecast, how many people are going to buy a Tesla very well. I regard that as similar to an epidemic. So I'm kind of skeptical that we could forecast quantitatively the progression of an epidemic. But I think we can provide models, frameworks for asking questions about would a particular mitigation be helpful or not? And could it be done at reasonable cost? So with that, yeah, I think I'll stop and open up to discussion.
Assuming all data available, can we truly focus the pandemic through modeling? And your answer is more or less negative. However, the next question to follow is, do you think we can explain it?
My understanding, so the goal would be, imagine we had this giant data feed and we could look across the experience of the transmission of COVID across, regions and countries. We ended up through cell phone data and, expenditure data and getting a lot of data on levels of people's activity. But my understanding is the relationship between those data and economic outcomes and disease outcomes kind of broke down after the initial phase of the epidemic. An expert in this could probably tell me maybe I'm wrong. So I'm not sure that even those data, I think it was subtle aspects of the nature of human interactions that impacted transmission. And so I'm not sure that we could even explain it. But I want to stress, if I can, macroeconomic models aren't so good either. So we kind of use them differently than hard scientists do. We use them as mental frameworks to think about policy options. And that is a intellectual gap I've found previously talking to pandemic, epidemiologists and mathematical modelers, that we kind of treat the models as a framework for asking ourselves, okay, what are we trying to achieve with a policy intervention? The example I would give was if you knew ex ante that Omicron was going to come along, you would have said, we're all going to get COVID. Okay, so what are we trying to achieve with mitigation and vaccines? Is we're trying to buy time so that we can give you the vaccine before you get COVID. But, we'll acknowledge that in the end, everyone's going to get COVID. That's not a quantitative statement, but if you had an epidemiologist or someone with expert in the immune system saying, the idea that we're going to wipe this disease out is infeasible and we're all going to get it, then that's a framework for thinking about, okay, what are our options in terms of reacting with policy?
Okay, so you're quite negative on those two questions. Let's see if you're more positive on this one, although I'm skeptic. So if the pandemic happened today, a new pandemic, are we ready as modelers, economic modelers, let's say it like this, because you're an economist? And based on your question, I'm going to ask later, what do we need to do to be ready? So those are two questions. Let's see what the answers are for this.
I think that there's some very useful things that we could do. So one of the papers I linked to that was with Michael Mina and Jim Stock and Michael Drost. So Michael Mina was pushing for rapid testing. He was and then I think he went and started a company that did rapid testing. And he would claim, oh, we should invest a lot of money in giving everybody at-home COVID tests, and then perhaps we'll achieve something. I think a modeler is very useful in assessing whether we should spend a lot of money, say on, I'm just using this as an example of an option of, say, a rapid test. What are the types of things that you would have to think about as a modeler would be, if the test has a lot of false positives, you might be doing more economic damage with the test than you are helping in mitigate the spread of disease. And then there would be questions of, okay, somebody at home comes up with a positive test. How do we ensure that they stay home as opposed to going out? Maybe we have to pay them some money. How much would that cost? So I think that modeling devoted to assessing this broader question of, is it worthwhile doing this intervention at, say, some massive scale versus, I think several countries tried to test everybody within the country within a very short time window and get people to stay home. Is that a strategy that would be useful? So I think that, what would it cost and what might be useful for having several 100,000 contact tracers? I think modelers could be very useful in answering questions about specific large-scale interventions.
Okay, I think, John, you were the first one with the hand up.
The comments I made before the thing actually started about the magnitude and scope of the whole, who cares about what if there's a pandemic? And your presentation was fascinating to me. And so one of the kind of questions, and it doesn't necessarily have to be answered now. This is where I wish this was a live meeting, and after we break up, we could all go off and talk to you and all that kind of stuff, but it isn't. So what is the economist's role in the world when there's a pandemic? That I don't expect the economists to come up with a solution to prevent me from getting sick. I had never thought about what economists do when there's a pandemic. My guess is you're concerned about, let's say we get to the end of the pandemic, what's the state of the nation in terms of economic capacity to continue to have people work and feed themselves. And so, when I look at what the economists are asking, and your kind of first slide there is, what can economists do? Well, in a couple crises, if I understand, you bought a lot of something. The recommendation, then we bought 3 times more for COVID than we did for the economic crash. Well, I don't exactly understand why you do that, but given this whole range of things that I don't understand, kind of the question right now is if we went 100 years ago and we didn't have computers in people's houses and we didn't have computational modelers even there, what would we have done? And because we had modeling in our life when this one occurred, what did the models themselves cause premature overcommitment to people's solutions to problems and put us on wrong paths, overcommitted way too soon, and there really is no way to get around that. That's the question. Did the models cause decision makers to overcommit to things?
So, okay, there was panic in financial markets starting
Yes.
in late February and into mid-March of 2020.
Yes,
So the
I
stock
even
market,
watched my 401k.
right.
Yes.
And so the specific reason, I would say the main reason that the Federal Reserve reacted as it did was that not just corporate bond markets, but the treasury market for the secondary market for U.S. government bonds began to break down. And nothing scares the U.S. government more than the prospect it would have difficulty selling more treasury bonds, because we need to do that all the time. Okay, you ask a question of, did the did the models feed the panic? So Glenda Gray, who's from South Africa at this meeting, had an interesting perspective. She said a large portion of sub-Saharan Africa went on lockdown in spring of 2020, and COVID didn't get there for 6 months. So she said, that was pointless. The the other thing that happened on the fiscal side that economists were involved in was that as we were watching unemployment soar, there was concern that, in the Great Depression, we had bread lines. That's how we dealt with it then. But if we have a pandemic, you don't want people lining up in a bread line. So there was a lot of work done very quickly on how can we get cash to people who are kind of not in the formal system. About half of the people in the United States don't file income taxes. And a lot of the way we sent money to people was to, reverse the IRS income tax mechanism. So people had to find other ways to get people money. So it was, and in countries that didn't do this, they would find people would, violate lockdowns and go out to work because they, didn't have any money. And so the role of economists there is to say, can we support a public health response by getting people cash so that they can continue to live if they're locked down, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not waiting till the end of the pandemic, but kind of dealing with it in real time is a major challenge. And then the other thing we could do in advance in preparation is say, when we think about public health interventions, we want to find ways that reduce transmission at minimal economic cost. I mean, I think ex post, many people say our shutting of schools for as long as we did is having massive economic costs, not just in the near term, but on the educational prospects of the people who were shut out of school for the rest of their lives. And so an economist might come in and say, we should have found some way to open up schools with a particular focus on that. So when I'm thinking about interacting with public health people, it's in helping choose interventions. You want to do ones that mitigate transmission at minimum economic cost.
That's good.
Go ahead, Vino.
So first of all, thank you so much for the talk. I'm a mathematical modeler. I do infectious disease model. I have been working on human behavior modeling into the classical SIR modeling, and then I've been looking at this perspective of trying to integrate economical idea into SIR model. Not much progress there, but I think this your take on all of this was really fresh, so I really appreciate that. So my question is, I know in the equations that you showed, there were just simple equations based on some assumptions that you have, as opposed to trying to for example, get it from a SIR type of equations. But also from your perspective, I'd be curious if you have thought about trying to integrate some kind of economic based model with a SIR type of model to try to get some kind of a feedback type of model between not just the disease but also the economy, just kind of like how people are thinking of feedback from behavior and the disease transmission type of model. Maybe it's a game theoretical approach, maybe it could be anything, but I'm curious if there is some kind of a merit in trying to think of some kind of a model that feeds back disease transmission into economics type of model, and then economical activity into disease transmission type of model. Although, in your in the figure that you showed that the largest dip happened in economical activity was really during the panic stage of the first wave. So I don't know if there is going to be a lot of merit into what is going to happen in the later stage of the outbreak, but I'd be curious.
So I did not, I mean, yes, a literature emerged that very quickly that did this. And I left off a reference to, a paper. There were kind of teams of people doing this. I think the central challenge in developing the two central challenges, I guess, are how do you model panic? So there's a paper I could send you a reference to that looked at Portuguese data. They had spending by Portuguese people by age and et cetera. And and then they tried to have a Bayesian model where individuals are updating their beliefs about the danger of the disease. So they're starting off with some prior when it arrives that is, and they found that they had to put in that people must have believed this was very dangerous given the strength of the initial reaction. And then they gradually updated and changed their behavior. So, I mean, if you take it a formal way of this, you have this problem. How do you specify that prior? Like, what do people believe when they first hear news of the disease, and what shapes those beliefs? Otherwise, that's just kind of a free parameter that's floating in your model. And then the next thing you have to do is deal with, initially we all did crazy things. We washed our grocery, we didn't touch our grocery bags and things like that. But then we kind of gradually learned these are the things you need to, stay outside, ventilate, etc. So I think modeling that learning process in real time is very difficult. It can be done, but I think most of that work is going to be ex post because, I mean, this is true in financial panics as well. The policymakers are looking for what's going to calm the panic, and we don't know what caused it to begin with, so it's hard to know how to react to it. So I mean, that's certainly a worthwhile endeavor, but I think it's a challenging endeavor because you're basically dealing with panic.
Sorry, I just wanted to say thank you. And just to kind of add to your point, do you think there is going to be some kind of a benefit if we could do, I know even the, retrospective, it's also difficult, but do you think if we have enough data retrospectively, and now I suppose we do have data about, not just the mortality, but how, the economical activity shifted, is there some kind of a retrospective learning that we could have from this perspective of getting a feedback type of model or anything of that nature?
I think the most useful thing that could come out of epidemiological modeling would be that when a new disease arrives, explain clearly kind of what the options are. For instance, is elimination really an option? Or is this thing going to become endemic? And then you have to, find a way to live with it. And I think, different diseases, my understanding is the answer to that question is different. And explaining those big picture options, is the doubling time of this disease going to be slow, or is the doubling time of this disease going to be fast? Is the what do we know about transmission routes? These are the types of things that I think from an economist's perspective would be most useful to have a sense of at the start of an epidemic. So you could begin thinking about, is this thing going to last for 3 years? Is it going to last for 6 months? That's the type of communication to economists that would be most useful, rather than, very detailed modeling.
And the problem is that early on, the uncertainties are so high that you can't really answer that question. And as you point out, for a new disease, you have very little information. And with exponential growth, being off by one day could make a huge difference. Having an uncertainty of 10% in the value of the exponential also gives you a huge uncertainty. And I certainly remember early on being on discussion groups which were trying to scrape the excess mortality rates by calling funeral homes and this kind of thing. And there really was very poor information. I think.
Yes, but since your working group is on immunology, I do want to ask that question I mentioned at the beginning. In that May 2022 meeting I had in Stockholm, Tulio de Oliveira was there, And I had the pleasure of meeting him. He reminded me of some prominent economists and his attitudes. But I asked him, are we going to get a variant that is going to be really deadly? And he said no. I wasn't sure what the basis for that statement was, but I think that if there's guidance from immunologists about, the probabilities are that the worst is over versus, something terrible is coming down the road, that could have been useful too.
Well, I think again, there's a folklore that viruses evolved to be less lethal,
Yeah.
probably because of the behavioral questions that you're discussing. Ebola, there is pretty good evidence when there are Ebola outbreaks, people isolate because it's known to be very lethal. Doesn't mean they eliminate risky behaviors, but the risky behaviors are very much reduced, and therefore you actually get self-extinction pretty quickly with most Ebola outbreaks.
Mhm.
And so there's certainly a level of lethality where people will self-isolate effectively. I kept thinking, although I don't know how you'd monitor it, that probably the single most effective thing you could have done with your $50 billion would have been pay people to wear masks, which would
Yeah.
have gotten your R much below 1 very quickly.
Well, so as a model that demonstrated that, you probably could have gotten the money to do it.
The place we tend to come in is more medical and technical, which is, for example, prophylaxis. The distribution of prophylactic medication is something that generally isn't done. And as you point out, there always are costs and benefits for any strategy. And prophylaxis is always a tricky one because if you're giving medication to people who might not be sick, then the safety criteria for approval are very, very high. We have, for example, medications like Tamiflu
Yes.
and others. The problem with all of those is that you have to give them within 24 to 48 hours of infection, or they're not very useful. And flu also is a little bit different from COVID in the sense that with flu, you're maximally infectious typically before you become ill.
Hmm.
And so that adds an additional problem to the question of how do you eliminate and reduce spread in the
Right. But so this
population.
is precisely the type of application I have in mind, where a modeler talking to an economist saying, okay, well, if we ramp this up to $50 billion, we could get a better outcome, or we can't because of the challenges that you just mentioned. Um, it's getting the public health people to think, maybe finish with this. James Bullard was the president of the St. Louis Fed, and I had a conversation with him, and he expressed his frustration because he had been working on this as well. He said, "I just think these guys haven't been through a crisis before. They don't know uh, how to respond at scale." And I don't know if that's a fair representation or not. So maybe I'll leave you with that.
I
I,
actually want to answer Andy his question, what to do with the $50 billion. Actually, perhaps the thing that we hurt most as modelers was not data was unavailable. Really, it was a problem finding it. And good data on how many people are infectious was a problem. So wastewater management, wastewater measurement is probably something to install. Like this is infrastructure. But if you have this infrastructure and the data is available next pandemic, I think it would improve our ability to do something.
Oh,
Not
I
maybe.
totally agree. The fact that serology data collected informally and the linking of it to death records was informal and we weren't ready to go with that. I totally agree. That, but Mark Lipshitz's response was he would do it on ventilation. So, ventilate, have improved ventilation at schools. So some, people have to pick and make a justification for where they want to spend their money.
your point about lags is critical. It's hard to model anything with delays in it. And your point that people get used to the situation and therefore the response to the same event changes when the event happens more than once is also difficult to include in a
Yes.
model. Well, I wish I had more time because I had a lot of comments and questions based on what you said, but I know your time is precious, and I want to thank you again. Maybe you'll come again and we can talk more about some of these issues. You've raised a lot of them, and I think we could all learn and perhaps respond more effectively by having this kind of conversation in a more systematic way.
Yeah, well, thank you. It was a pleasure to do.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I appreciate you coming today, and thank you for the really impressive set of questions that are ones that we should be thinking about much more.
Bye-bye.